Hello everyone, my name is Giovanna Sevilla and this is my presentation for the Divergent Thinking project. I'm gonna be streaming this from the comfort of my own classroom and I hope that you guys enjoy it. The topic that I'm going to be presenting to you guys is the topic of behaviorism and how we are managing behavior in the classroom. As a long-term substitute for first grade this first year, I had some previous experience with behavior before coming into the job, but going through the year, I really struggled with the behavior problems that were going on in my classroom, and that's why I wanted to present this topic to you guys to give you guys strategies and some ways for us to help better manage our behavior within our classroom management. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to cover is what is behaviorism. And if you see here, right, in this picture, there is a lot of things that behaviorism is tied to. But essentially, it is learning. Learning is an enduring change in observable behavior that occurs as a result of our experiences and stimuli from the environment. So as we learn all our behavior, we are gaining that from what we see in our environment and what is presented to us. So the origins of behavior comes from who we know as the father of behaviorism, John Brodus Watson. He was alive from 1878 to 1958. He believed that behaviorist theories needed to be supported through observational and measurable data. So our behavior needed to be backed up with some evidence of what was going on. From that, we saw that new behaviors can arise from classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, to start off, was first introduced by a Russian scientist known as Ivan Pavlov, and he discovered classical conditioning actually accidentally. He was experimenting with the salivation of dogs when they had a response in seeing food. This theory suggested that we learn behavior through our associations of our reflexes and our stimulus. So if we were presented in front of a cone of ice cream and our first instinct is, ooh, we want that ice cream. The next time we would see that ice cream, we would just see an ice cream shop, and we again were salivate thinking of that same ice cream. And so that was kind of what our classical conditioning is conditioning us to have a certain response towards something. So I actually use classical conditioning in my own first grade classroom. This example goes with having students greet each other good morning and goodbye every day from our classroom greeter or from the teacher. Now, at the beginning of the year, I struggled a lot with having my students greet each other and just having that welcoming and safe environment in my classroom. I felt like a lot of my first graders would kind of just not really interact with each other or with me. And so what I started doing is I started to put this in front of my door, and it has 4 different categories. It has a hug, a handshake, a high five, and a fist bump. Now, when these students come up and they go in through the door each morning, they can touch and choose which response or which greeting they would like to give me. My classroom greeter that I have for my class actually does this job for me, and she gives these students their response every day. So right here she gave one of the students a hug, over here she gave a handshake, over here she gave a high five, and over here she gave a fist bump. So the classical conditioning in my first grade classroom, my goal was to increase my student interaction and build my classroom community. And so I basically outlined this, how it looked like before I started conditioning and then after my conditioning. And so before my conditioning, I had an unconditioned stimulus. So basically, I would tell my students to say good morning or goodbye, just simple like, hey, good morning, or hey, goodbye. Could you say good morning or goodbye to me? Students would either say good morning or goodbye back, or and some of them would just walk past and not say anything. Now, I wanted to change that because I wanted them to have that natural interaction and I didn't want it to be forced. So, I started conditioning them and I came up with a neutral stimulus. So, I started giving the students those choices that we looked back in the other slide. And I would ask them how they would like to say good morning or goodbye. And I would prompt them by saying, you could choose hug, you could choose handshake, you could choose fist bump, or you can choose handshake. I don't know what the other one was. But students will say good morning and goodbye to other students or teacher. That's the goal that I wanted when I was doing the conditioning. And so as we practiced that every day for a couple of months, then after conditioning, I got a stable conditioned response. So basically, I would just have the students see the choices. I would give the students the choices. I would stand by the door. They already expected the choices that they knew were already there. And so the students eventually said good morning and goodbye without any prompts. They would go in. They sometimes wouldn't even look at the chart. They already know what their choice was that morning. And they would proceed by giving me that response. So it has been very successful, and I further extended this by just giving a student the position of the classroom greeter so that they're having that interaction with the other students as well. Another way that I use classical conditioning in my classroom is through the recitement of our rules. And so I have this good manners poster right here. The first one says, wait your turn, use polite words, listen carefully, cooperate with others, show your appreciation, and give compliments. These rules are recited and reviewed every day at our morning meeting, and I'll have students participate by telling me which manner they think they should practice the most that day, or which manner they know off the top of their head. The other one that I use is our lining up rules. Now, lining up in the primary classroom is very, very important because we want to teach those kids that they need to have expectations and behaviors when they're out in the hallway, when they're coming back from recess, when they are going to different places. And so my line rules right here are actually recited by students who I choose to be our caboose. They will stand right here at the side of the line, and they will check to see if all the students' hands are by their sides, if they are standing straight and tall, if they are facing forward, and if they are ready for the hall. And they recite these every day. And so once the caboose starts doing this and the student starts being conditioned to do these things, then just depending on the caboose to remind them each time. Now let's go into operant conditioning. The origin of this comes from Burris Frederick Skinner, or as short, B.F. Skinner. He is known for operating on environments by initiating behaviors. Okay, so his theory stated that learning in which consequences of behavior produce changes in the probability that it will occur. So whatever happens after our behavior would kind of determine whether that behavior will happen again. If a behavior is followed by reinforcement, whether positive or negative, it is more likely to be repeated. If it is followed by a punishment, it is less likely to be repeated. So if we give praise, positive reinforcement to a student, she is more likely to produce that good behavior again. If it is followed by a punishment, if we implement an effective punishment to our student, they are less likely to do that undesired behavior again. This is a quote I found about B.F. Skinner that I really enjoyed. It states that the ideal of behaviorism is to eliminate coercion, To apply controls by changing the environment in such a way as to reinforce the kind of behavior that benefits everybody. Okay? So behavior is kind of tricky. We have to really observe and measure why we are exhibiting these behaviors and why they are happening with our students. So this is kind of details the processes of a behavior. So first, a situation is something that happens. Something happens before. This allows you to think about and interpret that situation as happening. Then we usually get an emotional response to that behavior. So we get a feeling. We could feel sad, we could feel upset, and then that goes into our action, our response to that emotion. Now, this quote is saying by changing the environment, we can reinforce a behavior that benefits everybody. So if we were to change that situation that happens, we can change how we think about that situation and how we feel about that situation in order to get the behavior that we want. So reinforcement right here is basically all these types leading to behavior. So behavior there's two types of behavior. There's desirable behavior and there's undesirable behavior. So basically the behaviors that we want and the behaviors that we don't want. The behaviors that we want to do with positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement because we really want to increase that good behavior. Undesirable behavior, we really want it to go away. So we're going to push that with extinction and we're going to push that with punishment. So punishment is essentially designed to weaken behaviors instead of increasing them. So on our focus on undesirable behaviors, we have basically, we all as teachers tend to are talking out of turn, getting out of task, things like that. So what I have used in my own classroom is a response cost to undesirable behaviors. So if we look here, these are not my blurt beans, but this is an example of somebody's blurt beans. This is used to eliminate chatter in a lot of student talking. So essentially what you do is each student gets 3 to 5 beans each day at the beginning of the day. If a student talks or interrupts while the other teacher is talking, they have to take one of their beans and place it in the blurt beans jar. Now this allows students to have a cost to whenever they blurt, they have to put it in there. And then at the end of the day, if there's any extra beans, they go in the reward jar. This allows students to see that the less time they start blurting, the more they will keep their beans and the more it goes into the rewarding beans box and less of the blurt beans box. So its purpose is to eliminate chatter. Over here, I use a losing point system, a response cost to breaking any of our class manners or rules. I use this on Class Dojo. They can lose points for being disrespectful, being disruptive, breaking line rules, and not following directions. By following the rules, they avoid and eliminate that chance of losing points, and so they are less likely to do that behavior again. Now going into the fun stuff, the positive reinforcement that I use in my classroom. I use a lot of positive reinforcement in the primary classroom because we are working with students who are 5 to 7 years old and are really starting to really develop behaviors and their identities. And so what I like to use a lot is my Class Dojo. Each student gets a monster with their name and they get to earn points for specific rewards. So what I have for my reward system is for every 5 points, the students will get a ticket. For every 10 points, they get a good note home to parents. For every 15 points, they pick a small prize from the prize box. For every 20 minutes, they get 2 times tickets, so 2 tickets. 25 points, they get to sit in the teacher chair. And 30 points, they use bouncy balls as a chair for a day. Now, this is meant to increase student behavior when we present them with the consequence of or behavior, okay? Or reinforcer, I'm sorry, with the consequence or reinforcer. So the more the students are doing what they're supposed to do, the more likely they are going to get a point and add these into our reward system. So they're more likely to get praised and rewarded. Another one that I have really seen a big change in is our AR goals. Now this is a bulletin board that I have here. And I have it designed as balloons. Now, AR, if you guys aren't familiar with, is accelerated reading, where students have to read books at their reading level and take quizzes on them, which are 5 questions, comprehension tests. And they need to reach 8 points by the end of the quarter to receive a whole school AR activity reward. Now, at the beginning of the year, first grade, they didn't do AR in kindergarten, so I really struggled with how to motivate them and how to get them to just read the story or listen to a story and take a quiz on it, because this is essentially quizzing them on their comprehension skills. And so what I started doing is I made this bulletin board and I had every kid's name on it, and as they reached their AR goal, as they reached their points, I would move up their balloon up the sky until they would reach the AR point system for that quarter. So this quarter, we had to reach 8 AR points for all the quarter, and so far I have about 6 students that have met it, and they have until the end of this month to do this. So we're at a pretty good start. So I've seen a lot of motivation with that. And also, I've used a ticket economy. So a ticket economy is basically, I just use the tickets that you would use like at raffles or at carnivals. And I would give them to students who would bring back their homework that are exhibiting any of these good, positive behavior. And I would have them write their number on a ticket, so I didn't know whose it was or what their name was. And on every Friday, I would shake the bucket and I would pull 2 student names out, and they would get a small prize from the prize box. And this is actually one of the better ones that I've used because it's actually a tangible item. So they get really excited when they actually receive something. So this is one that I have really enjoyed. Alright, now negative reinforcement in my first grade classroom. Like I said, I like all the positives, but I do use some negative reinforcement to kind of increase and come back to that positive behavior. One of the examples that I tend to use a lot is instead of having somebody give someone attention negatively and saying, please sit down and cross your legs, or can you please sit down, and addressing them that way, I will set an example by modeling that one person is doing that desired behavior so that the other ones can do it. So for example, I'll say, I see that Ginny is sitting with her feet crisscrossed and her hands folded, ready to listen. And as soon as I say that, I can see all the students start doing the same thing. So then they start being conditioned and they are reinforced to then do the same thing so that they can be praised just like Jimmy did. So this essentially increases behavior by removing or avoiding that aversive stimulus. So it's removing that way of, so it's essentially removing that stimulus that we're not getting that undesired behavior. So essentially, it's removing that aversive stimulus that the teacher will reprimand you if you're not sitting correctly. It is not necessarily a punishment, as we're still wanting to increase the behavior by just simply avoiding a punishment. So the students are going to want to avoid not being told to sit down properly, so they're going to make sure they do the same thing as everybody else. Okay, so going further into this, as we started reading into this behaviorism, there is a kind of like a system that's called the Applied Behavior Analysis, ABA. Personally, in my experience, I have done applied behavior analysis within homes with students with or individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And so I actually get to use this in my own classroom this year because I also have a student with that same ability. So what it does, it uses the principles of operant conditioning to improve student behavior. So the goal is to improve our behavior and give that positive behavior support. It is widely used in classrooms with students who are mainly disruptive and have exceptionality. So students who have autism spectrum disorders, ADD, and ADHD. And like I said, I have used this in and out of the classroom. And so as I started looking at applied behavior analysis, it's really important to know exactly how these behaviors come to mind and how they occur. So there is actually 4 main functions of behavior that we often see. And so we have the first one is attention. An individual will start exhibiting behavior to gain a positive or negative attention from students, teachers, or others. So if a student is acting out, it's because they want some sort of attention from someone. They want the eyes on them. The other one is to escape. Now, this individual might be exhibiting a behavior to escape a situation, an activity, environment, or person. So what happens here is if a student is refusing to do their work, then they are choosing to escape having to complete the work and having to work their minds into it. And so they are choosing to act out. Escape has actually been one of the ones that was a big issue for me at the beginning of the year. The student in my class would actually escape and leave my classroom physically and run down the hallways because he did not want to do a task or when given a demand. And so that was one of the behaviors that I really saw in that student. Another function is sensory. So an individual can exhibit behavior to give themselves an internal sensation that is pleasing. So sensory is really like our 5 senses: touch, smell, hear, taste, all that stuff. And so a good example of this is when a student has to bite on a pencil to focus, they have to stomp their feet, they have to wiggle their chair around just to focus. That is all sensory. They need to be doing something in order for them to complete another task. And the last 4 major function of behavior is an access to a tangible. So sometimes a student will engage in a behavior because they want access to a preferred item or an activity. An example of this is students will complete classwork to earn class dojo points. So that is actually a desired behavior that they're doing. But on the other hand, if a student is acting out and having a misbehavior because they want an item, they will usually, they could cry, they could scream, they could hit, all that stuff, just because they want that certain item. Okay, so the steps in this applied behavior analysis that I settled down and I use in my everyday classroom and outside of the classroom is first I have to identify the target behaviors. I have to figure out what exactly are they engaging in and how we could fix it. Okay? Then we have to establish the baseline for the target behaviors. So basically what we're going to do to make sure that those behaviors can be fixed. And then step number 3 is choosing which reinforcers and punishers are appropriate for that certain student. So measuring behaviors. What I do in my class is I do daily ABC data. And ABC data is basically I am writing down everything that happens in a behavior. So I'm writing in the antecedent. I'm writing what's happening before a behavior occurs. Then I'm writing what the actual behavior was. So I'm writing what happened during the behavior. And then I'm writing the consequence, what happened after the behavior. Behavior is highly influenced through antecedents obtained from environmental conditions and prompts and cues. So basically, with enough data, we can identify how the target behaviors are happening. So this is an example for a student that I have in my classroom. The antecedent, what happened before the behavior, was they were given a direction, task, or activity during a transition or transition between location or activity. So this was after our centers. Their preferred activity was interrupted because as they were transitioning from one center to the other, they had to put an iPad away. Now this disrupted it because they did not want to put it back, and this disrupted their routine of having to let go of that item and put it away. So the behavior was they refused to follow directions, and they were screaming and yelling as they were not wanting to put the iPad away, and they ran away and bolted out of my classroom. So they were doing that escape. This happened for 5 to 10 minutes, and the intensity of this was high. So I had to detail whether how long it took, if it was low, medium, or high intensity, and where it was, and this was during centers, but I didn't put that there. But the consequence after that. Now this consequence is what the teacher did or what the person did in that instance to correct the behavior. Now what I did was I gave them a physical system prompt to put the iPad back, and then I kept the demand on them. I didn't want to negatively reinforce them to go put them back because that would only increase their behavior instead of weaken it. So I gave them the physical assistant prompt, and I kept the demand on. So another way that I have measured their behavior is through functional behavior assessment. Now, right as I already did my ABC data, this is the next step. So this identifies which of the antecedents and the consequences influence their behavior. So what happens before and what happens after is what happens for the behavior. So right here are some examples that I have used with my student for a functional behavior assessment. This is similar to the ABC data, except that it just uses a coding key to implement everything. So I have my date and my time right here, the location of where it happened, the activity it was, and my antecedent behaviors and consequences. Now, as we did this, we kind of had to see which ones were occurring the most. So if every time during the calendar rug they were told no, then they screamed and ran, and I gave them a verbal reprimand. If that was happening and that still was occurring, then we had a target behavior, and we had to introduce another behavior, a replacement behavior, in order to lessen that behavior, if that makes sense. Over here is what we started doing. So we started to figure out what the target behaviors were for this student. The target behaviors were is when a teacher gives the student a command, he is non-compliant. He refuses to do tasks and he refuses to do work by telling the teacher no or leaving and escaping the room. The second target behavior was he touches other students and adults inappropriately. This behavior is demonstrated by pushing others, kicking others, calling others names, and hitting others with an open hand. Okay? So as we did these target behaviors, then we needed to start to implement some replacement behaviors. So we needed to come up with some strategies of how he could lean away from those target behaviors and start implementing these new behaviors that were positive for him. So one of the replacement behavior was when given a demand, the student will comply with the adult's request by completing the task and remaining in the area. When he wants attention from his teacher, he will use a pre-taught method to gain that attention. So if he wanted some attention, whether good or bad, he needed to use that strategy with me in order to refrain from the non-compliance. The replacement number 2 over here is he needs to actively keep his hands to himself. In school situations when a behavior is expected. If he wants to interact physically with other peers, he needs to ask for a high five or another agreed upon gesture. So instead of going up to someone and punching them, instead you can do a fist bump, you can do a high five, and things like that. This is essentially too because this student has struggles with social situations. And so hitting others and doing all that play fighting is kind of normal for this student. And so we wanted to replace that behavior with something that was more behavior appropriate. So the last way that I measure their behavior in kind of different ways, is through a behavior report. And I just started doing this recently because I started seeing that my student really needed to know how he was doing throughout the day and have that visual for him to see. And so basically what I have on this paper is all the times throughout the day where he goes through transitions, goes to different classes and things like that. And then I have to mark how his behavior was at every transition. So for example, during our breakfast and morning meeting every day, today he did okay. And the reason why he did okay was because he was not sitting or listening during the morning meeting, and he was pacing around the carpet instead of listening into what we were doing. And so basically, I circled that as okay. And as we go here, I go and I conference with my student, and I have them assess themselves to see how they did during the day. So this helps them see whether they get the reward at the end of the day or they don't. This allows them to see how they're doing, and this really is used for because my student at the end of the day has the reward of playing the Wii on the Mario Kart in the special education classroom as a reward. And before I would just have them always ask me like, do I get the Wii today or do I not? And I didn't have this documentation. And so when I didn't have that evidence, I kind of felt myself as a teacher that I didn't really have a good evidence to say whether he did good or not, because it was just under my opinion, but he didn't know what he was doing wrong. Only I did. And so I started doing this, and I give this to him every day at the end of the day, whether I circled yes or no if he got the Wii. If he gets more smiley faces, if he does great more, then he gets the Wii. If he does not get more smiley faces and it's more okay or poor choices, we get the no for the Wii. And so that way he at least sees that his behavior that day was not good. So positive reinforcement that I've used with students with ASD or ADHD and my specific student is having a star token reward system. Now we implemented this at the middle of the year, I believe, and we used it with masking tape on his desk. So basically the student receives a star for every and any appropriate behavior that is presented to him. So if he picks up a pencil from the floor, if he says thank you, if he pushes in his chair, all of that is praise and it deserves a star. A star is given per minute, whether it is just the smallest thing or the biggest thing. But it always has to be a positive behavior. We don't give any stars for negative behavior. So as we go along, after every 5 stars collected throughout the day, the students get to have a choice of a snack from their snack pack. So as you can probably see in this picture, there is lines right here where he divided where he gets that snack. And we do this every day. Sometimes we don't get to have the snack because we only get a little bit of stars and we're having a rough day. but this has really, really, really helped my student. Negative reinforcement that I implement with the same student is visual supports. Now, I don't want to negatively reinforce him too much because he needs a lot of that positive behavior supports in order to behave appropriately in the classroom. So what I do is I give him behavior supports, and these right here, as you can see in the picture, is giving breaks to decrease an undesired behavior and increase a positive behavior once he's calm. So he gets 4 break cards throughout the day that he has in a specific location in the room. Whenever he is feeling overwhelmed with sensory overload or working memory overload, then he will give me one of these break cards and I will let him have a break for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And sometimes I will give him that choice. The other thing that I do is I give him 4 choices cards. So if he is not complying to a task and I want him to either do this or do another task, I will give him these 4 choice cards to encourage him to do non-preferred activities. So I could say you could either do your work at your desk or you could do your work at the table. But the main idea is he's still doing the work. He's not escaping the work. He's still having to do that demand, just in a different location or a different situation. And so I give him 4 choices between A or B. He has to pick one of them. So as I have described behaviorism in my own personal experience and my classroom, I think it's important that we apply behaviorism with all our learners across our own classrooms and into your classrooms. And so the most important thing that I believe is you have to find applications and practices that are going to work best for your students and for your classroom. We really want to focus on the desired behaviors and the appropriate reinforcement schedules. So depending on what kind of students you have in your class, whether you have some with exceptionalities or some that are disruptives, you really need to make sure that you're putting the appropriate ones so you get a lot of that desired behavior. Behaviorism has really allowed teachers, given so many teachers these tools to create orderly classrooms within their classroom management. This year alone, I think with my experience with behavior already, I still feel overwhelmed because I was so used to working with just one individual rather than so many individuals. And so when I started learning how to apply positive reinforcement within all these students, then I started feeling a lot better about myself. And so these are just my references that I used for this presentation. I hope that you guys enjoy this presentation on behaviorism. And I have really enjoyed researching a lot about behaviorism and applying my own experiences with them. So thank you very much, and I'll see you guys soon.